The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit.
Giving go my soul.
Real, live, lit. Right? The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Abdullah, Outreach Events Coordinator out of the Office of Deputy Chair, member of the African People's Socialist Party, and I'll be your MC this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share this stream. Invite your friends and family to it so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion as possible. This week, the chairman continues reading from the book Materialism and the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth, Chapter 8, titled The Laws of Development, pages 77 to 85, and Chapter 9, The New and the Old, pages 86 to 92, pardon me. In this study, we will learn that political and historical events occur due to the conflict of social forces, which helps us to identify problems and their solutions. This helps us move away from the idealistic explanations offered by the ruling class and gives us the tools to apply revolutionary science for practical real-world solutions. In this study, Chairman deepens our understanding of the necessity of having our own theory, African internationalism, the worldview of the African ruling class. With these studies, we strive to churn out African working class intellectuals, one to the understanding that this world can be changed with our hands and the practical implementation of our theory. We ask that you begin to prepare your questions regarding the topic so the chairman can expound more on certain ideas. You can also catch up on this reading by reviewing the previous 6 Omali Taught Me's. To deepen our understanding of dialectical materialism and its practical application, I proudly introduce my leadership, the brilliant theoretician behind African internationalism, the theory developed with the understanding of the dialectical materialist method, leading to practical solutions for African and colonized peoples worldwide. Chairman Omali Yeshitela.
Uhuru. Uhuru Comrades, brothers and sisters. Before getting into the study, I wanted to share with you information regarding an upcoming mobilization in Washington, D.C. that is being sponsored by the Black is Black Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. As most of you know, this coalition is an organization of organizations. There are approximately 16 or 17 different organizations that at this moment constitute the Black is Black Coalition for Social Justice. with representatives from each of the 17 organizations constituting the steering committee of that organization. And our party played a fundamental and critical role in the development of that coalition, pulling it together more than 10 years ago. And in fact, on November 2nd and 3rd, the coalition will be holding its 11th consecutive mobilization in Washington, D.C. We held the first mobilization, national demonstration against the Obama regime, the first black or African demonstration at the White House after Obama was in power, to the chagrin of many Obamaites, and many of whom have subsequently come to see the errors of their way. What I want to do now is just give you the press statement, press release regarding that, and we'll show a brief video promoting that event on November 2nd and 3rd. And I'm calling on everybody to begin to organize to get there. This is a really important mobilization. All of them are important, but this is an extraordinarily important mobilization. Given the context right now of imperialism in a state of disarray, crisis, and what have you, and a way to protect ourselves from experiencing the crisis of imperialism as our own crisis. And so annual march and rally on the White House demands an end to worldwide imperialist wars. The Black is Back Coalition 10th annual march on the White House turned imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. I think this is going to be actually the 11th mobilization, the 10th year of our founding, the 11th mobilization that we've done. So that's November 2nd and 3rd, 2019. On November 2nd and 3rd, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will convene its 10th annual conference in Washington, D.C. The theme of this year's mobilization is Turn Imperialist Wars into Wars Against Imperialism, a theme expressed in opposition to the U.S. invasion of the Middle East, attacks on Venezuela, Cuba, and throughout South America, and acknowledges the under-recognized wars waged by the U.S., France, and others throughout Africa. Since its founding 10 years ago on September 12, 2009, the Black is Back Coalition has sought to unite the black self-determination movement. Comprised of, it says here, 15 organizations and many individuals, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations has fought for social justice, reparations, and an end to every form of imperialist aggressions against black people and the peoples of the world. This includes mass imprisonment, police murder, and the false borders imposed on Africa, exploitation of peoples in the U.S. and around the world. According to, it says that I said this, now is the time to throw off all hesitation, open up new fronts of struggle, and to launch every protest, demonstration, and anti-imperialist actions from the ballot box to the barricades as an act to deepen the crisis of imperialism. The weekend of events will convene on Saturday with a march and rally at Malcolm X and Lafayette Park. Sunday's events include a conference at Thurgood Marshall Academy featuring members of the Black is Back Steering Committee. That will include me, Vice Chair Lisa Davis from the People's Organization of Progress, who is located in Newark, New Jersey, co-founder Glenn Ford from Black Agenda Report, the 2016 Green Party presidential nominee Ajamu Baraka with the Black Alliance for Peace. And other presenters will include Ralph Pointer from the Lynn Stewart Committee, Betty Davis of the New Abolitionist Movement, Zaki Baruti, Universal People's Organization, Universal African People's Organization, Khalid Rahim, the New African Independence Party, Reverend Edward Pinkney, Black Autonomy Network Community Organization, Nellie Beal, the Harlem Tenants Council, Cam Howard from Incobra, Belinda Parker Brown, Louisiana United International, and Diop Olukbala, the Black Community Control of the Police, and Jihad Abdul Mumit from Jericho Movement. For more information, contact Black is Back media coordinator David Lance by phone. That's 727-914-3617, or Black is Back Coalition Vice Chair Lisa Davis at 973-517-1405, or visit blackisbackcoalition.org. I just want to say that among the things here, there's an error in identifying Comrade Nellie Bailey's organization. It's no longer the Harlem Tenants Council. There's another organization, and I just don't. I think we have to be careful not to make those kinds of errors, because you made a real point to say that there was another. I think it's Harlem Fight Back against wars and something to that effect. So we want to. I mentioned earlier, before we started this discussion, that I participated on last Sunday, I think it was, in an anti-war mobilization in New York City, in Manhattan. And a point that I wanted to make, and I don't think I made as well as I could have, you know, we constantly see demonstrations and things like that opposing what the United States is doing in places like Iran and Venezuela, the threat that they make in terms of war, Iran and other places. And at some juncture, we have to conclude that it's not enough just to occupy a Venezuelan embassy, that our responsibility is greater than that. And we have to not assume that somehow the people in Venezuela, suffering as they are suffering from economic quarantine, which is an act of war, the people of Iran who are suffering the consequences of economic quarantine, isolation by the U.S. and other imperialist powers, are going to make this revolution for us. And that's what it is that we do. We say, you know, occupy this embassy and protest this and that, as opposed to opening up fronts of struggle where we are. That is to say, not simply to be opposing what the U.S. is doing some other place, but actually building a movement here that makes it necessary for the United States to have to defend itself here. And of course, the most glaring example of what has to happen can be found here with the African Liberation Movement, that the people who are occupying embassies, it can be offensive to see a group of white folk and white-led folk who are saying, stop the war, stop what's happening in Venezuela, and occupy the Venezuelan embassy so that some traitor from Venezuela cannot pretend to be the leadership of the Venezuelan people on the one hand. And I'm there and I'm listening to them who they were protesting justly. The arrest, imprisonment of Julius Assange, Chelsea Manning, and I want them to be freed too. But how can they do that on the one hand without calling for the freedom of Sundiata Acoli, without calling for the freedom of Jalil Montekin, I think his name is, it was Anthony Bottoms when I knew him. These people have been locked up for more than 40 years as people who are trying to make a struggle to free African people. This is a war that's never recognized by the white left, by the so-called anti-war, anti-imperialist movement that made it necessary for us to organize the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice and Peace and Reparations, because of these struggles that happened right under the nose of what is called the white left. And before this meeting happened, we are concerned because someone who had indicated solidarity with our movement, a North American, or as people would say, white person, a couple, who seemed to be really united with trying to change things in this country, but backed off because of something they saw in the Berningspear newspaper, our publication. And I'm told that what they saw that was really disturbing for them is that the party calls for the freedom of all of the African people who are locked up in these prisons. And that is disconcerting because we call for the freedom of all the people locked up in the prisons because Africans experience colonial domination. And the prison issue, this mass incarceration of African people, where 1 out of every 8 human beings on earth that is in prison is an African in the United States. This is simply a symptom of the colonial domination oppression. So when you see the poverty, when you see the gentrification and all these other things, these are expressions of the same thing that's responsible for the prisons being filled with African people, except it is the white left and many white liberals are afraid of black people, and especially so-called criminals, because they unite with the concept that somehow the state, which is illegitimately, which is something that was imposed on Africans and Mexicans and the indigenous population here at gunpoint. This is a relationship that we didn't volunteer for. Africans are the only people other than the indigenous people who did not come to this country looking for a better way of life, but lost a better way of life. And the poverty and hunger that we see and the mass imprisonment is a symptom of what has occurred to us. And so there are white people who are afraid of African people. I remember just growing up and just walking across the street, and white people have come to stop signs or come to the lights, stop lights and what have you, and I'm crossing the street and they automatically start putting the locks on their doors like somehow I'm going to commit some offense against them. I am the one against, that a crime has been committed against. And yet, I mean, if I'm not running every time I see somebody white, I mean, I am a part of the aggregate that has experienced white terror on the one hand. And it might be true that somebody snatched your grandmama's purse, but that is an individual act that has come in response to everything else that we're looking to. So we want to win people to unity with ending this kind of relationship, and unity with the African people who say that we must release these people because it's a colonial entity, a colonizer that's locked us up. And for us, it's important to win everything we can. We want to win people to unity against colonialism. That's why we're not anti-racist. We don't require people to like Ray Charles, white people. We don't require people to learn the latest black dances and all that stuff. I don't care about that. The question is, can you unite that African people need not be oppressed, need not live under colonial domination? Can you unite with our aspiration to be free like everybody else on the planet Earth, or not? And so anyway, I want to go ahead. Can we say that we are pursuing this mobilization November through the Black is Black Coalition under the theme, turn imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. That we have a responsibility to open up new fronts of struggle wherever we are. So we're going to show a video now, right? Uhuru, just a short video. Uhuru.
Now is the time to throw off all hesitation. Months of struggle and to launch every protest, demonstration, and anti-imperialist action.
The Black is Black Coalition recognizes that it's not enough to call for peace. We call for 2, 3, many Venezuelas.
From the ballot box to the barricades.
The boldest, newest vision, progressive platform that you will find out there in the world today.
As an act to deepen the crisis of imperialism.
This system is a foul social system born of slavery and genocide. It will never do anything for us.
Every protest against police and white civilian murder of our people.
Y'all think it's cool to kill black people and then get on paid leave?
These police, man, these pigs, they are everywhere in our community, everywhere.
County police, state police, you name it. If there's a police organization, it is here.
Every mass mobilization to demand the end of the cruel, bloody economic war against Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Iran, Korea, and Russia. the other wars, not the one, just the one that might send some white kid to some place in the Middle East, but all these other wars.
The protesters continued to circle Times Square.
The attack that the U.S. is planning to launch against Syria represents an overall attempt on the part of U.S. imperialism to maintain its control over that region of the world.
We have to give them a problem that they can only solve to benefit us. Do you understand?
The U.S. and all imperialist powers, new and old, must be expelled from Africa, and the U.S. domestic colonial occupation forces known as police must be driven out of our colonized communities as part of the struggle against colonialism and imperialism.
I'm a revolutionary. Let me just tell you that right up front. I'm a revolutionary. I think that you have to overturn the whole damn system before we will ever be free. But I recognize that everybody in here ain't revolutionary. We need activity and action by masses of people who've never heard of revolution, never thought about revolution, but they believe in something called justice.
Join the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations for our annual march on the White House in Washington, D.C. on November 2nd and 3rd. For more information, go to www.blackisbackcoalition.org.
So, thank you. Were people able to see this who are viewing this study? Okay, I'm sorry, the people in the room where we are not able, we're not able to see that. We didn't set it up appropriately for that. But I want to, again, express appreciation for everybody who's come to this study. And again, we are talking about dialectical materialism as a strange name. It's not something that we run into commonly in any discussion that we have with the people, but it is a method of investigation and analysis that we think is critical. And certainly it's a critical weapon in the hands of the oppressed and of the working class. And we've been involved in this particular study now for several weeks. And we do this because we have a responsibility to take revolutionary science to the African working class itself. And because there is the bourgeoisie, it has these discussions all the time, but it speaks primarily to the ruling class. I mean, and I say to representatives of the ruling class, I have here, for example, Foreign Affairs, which is a journal that comes out regularly. It's a bourgeois journal. When I say bourgeois, I mean that this is written not just for ordinary people, workers, ordinary white people even. These are the thinking representatives of the ruling class who speak to each other. This is the journal that they have. These are people who write in these journals, people who are trying to convince elements of the ruling class that their ideas represent the best ideas in order to move the system forward in explaining the reality that people are affected by. You've read and heard of Machiavelli's The Prince. Well, The Prince, Machiavelli did this thing in The Prince because he was trying to win favor with the Medici. He wanted to be the representative himself of the prince. These are the ideas that you can use to rule the world with. And the ruling class has been doing this, and it does this even now. There are institutions and schools, journals that are there for the thinking representatives of the ruling class who attempt all the time to define for the ruling class the world, how it functions, and how the interests of the system itself, the bourgeois system, the capitalist system, the colonial order, can continue to serve them. And what happens is that many of these people end up, who write for this, who participate in these discussions, they are in different administrations right now. I mean, one of the key persons writing this for this is Elizabeth Warren, who in here is writing about a foreign policy for all. So I'm just saying that different representatives, you've heard of Brzezinski. Brzezinski, there's another journal that Brzezinski is associated with that serves the same purpose, more or less, for trying to influence the policies and understanding of whoever is in power. And again, they end up often in these administrations. Some of them are obvious, like Brzezinski. It's kind of warm in here. I didn't say anything because I thought perhaps it's because I'm under the lights, but I see other people that are fanning, so it's kind of warm in here. So they have these discussions, and this is January, February this year, with the basic title of this journal being "Who Will Run the World?" This is what the bourgeoisie is talking. Who will run the world? America, China, and global order. This is how they've titled this overall. And the introduction to the journal, which is done by, I think, the editor of the journal. Yeah, it is Gideon Rose. And just a couple of things. It says that 2 decades ago, the U.S.-sponsored liberal international order seems to be going from strength to strength. Now both order and sponsor are in crisis, and the future is up for grabs. This is extraordinary. This is the, see, both the international order and its sponsor, right, in crisis, and the future is up for grabs. There are many elements of the story: military and economic blunders, stagnation for the middle and lower classes in the developed world, a populist backlash against globalization, dizzying technological change, but a shifting balance of power may be the most important of all. This is what we've been talking about, I don't know for how long. They just, you know, that's why we focus on how the troubled hegemon and the confident challenger are trying to write the story's next chapter. Of course, the troubled hegemon is the U.S., and the confident challenger is China. So the basic point that this thing revolves around is the assumption that China and the United States will define the future, that who is going to rule the world. It's the whole premise of this thing that these two powers should dominate the whole world is extraordinary, or it should appear to be extraordinary, that one of two forces is going to dominate the whole world, going to make the decision of what happens here in North St. Louis ultimately and other places around the world. So these are discussions that's happening among the ruling class. And this is something that I've just shown you. It's hidden in plain view. You can go to Barnes & Noble's or your regular bookshop, and this journal is there, but you won't pick it up because it wasn't written for you. There's nothing titillating or exciting about it. There are no comics in here. There's no horoscopes in here. There's no sports section, you know. This is written for the bourgeoisie and its representatives. These are contests. These are discussions that they have. And they're fleshing this stuff out, flushing these questions out for discussions among each other and to inform other sectors of the bourgeoisie or people who are close to them. So here we are in North St. Louis, in a sector of the African community that has been predetermined for failure, to fail. In the heart of the African working class, of people who lived under colonial domination for ages. And there are certain sectors of our own population here in this country, in Africa, and other places around the world who more or less either united with the basic definition of this reality that's imposed on us by the people who are writing for Foreign Affairs and other journals and who are functioning as the leadership of this system. Most of them either believe it or they've assumed there's nothing that they can do to change it. And of course, what we're looking at is that people see the world through their own class perspective, their own place in this whole social system. And the African petty bourgeoisie is a tiny a tiny sector of the African population. It has no philosophies of its own. We call them windshield wipers. Depending on which way the wind seems to be blowing, boom, they'll go that way. If the wind seems to shift, they'll go that way. They are not tethered. Their philosophy is not born of itself. It depends on who seems to be, what way the world seems to be moving at a particular time. And its judgment, the petty bourgeoisie, is also affected by the fact that it's such a small social force. I mean, you could almost by name identify sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie with any kind of influence. They're so small. And they see the world also based on their own size and their own sense of competence. At different times when masses of African people rise up, they become more confident, especially since they assume that they are leading these masses of people and the mass of people are going to go where they want to go. And so you see the petty bourgeoisie at different times it becomes confident, it talks about black power, is able to talk about black power and all these other things based on what they see as the strength of the masses of African people. The masses of African people are not as intimidated by the bourgeoisie, by the capitalist system, as these sectors of the petty bourgeoisie. They're not, because they live every day with this stuff, and they're in an ongoing contest with the bourgeoisie. It's their children who are being thrown into these prisons on a regular basis. It's their children, and the children in our community that's growing up with incessant violence, trauma, and this kind of thing. And we know something about this system. And we also know from time to time our own strength, our own power. We see, especially in a place like St. Louis, the people can have confidence because that's all we see. And we're dealing with this enemy on a regular basis. So it's critical for us to recognize the significance of the African working class as a social force. It is not tethered to the bourgeoisie. In fact, it has nothing. It has nothing to lose. So what has to happen is we have to be able to help the working class see a future, because the petty bourgeoisie can see no future. It is the absence of seeing such a future with all the oppression, with all the terror, that's imposed on us on a daily basis, where we're even afraid for our children to stand up at the bus stops early in the morning to catch the bus because a stray bullet or a cop or anything like that can affect them. These are the forces who, once they understand, that's what we have to take the science so they can understand this reality and then provide leadership and organization to help people overturn this. Without that, of course, the people become vulnerable to the assumptions of the ruling class. It's the ruling class that feeds them through movies, feeds them through other things. I mean, you got Africans in this community who, you got rappers and things like that who fashion their philosophy, their understanding of the world based on comic strips, on gangster movies that they see and what have you. So it's our responsibility to be in these communities to take revolutionary theory, and that's why we're having this discussion. We have to understand it, and then we have to go among our people, right, and take this philosophy. And we have to explain it to the world, because the world doesn't have good explanations for what is happening. And that's why also so many people are susceptible to the explanations given by the ruling class, by Trump, by Warren, by Obama, by all of these other forces. The African working class has to have its own ability to assess, to analyze, and interpret this world that we live in, and that's our responsibility. That's why we're having this discussion. So, and then we want other people, our friends, because one thing that we've understood in the African People's Social Party a long time ago, there's no such thing as an explanation of the world that's an African explanation. And what I mean by that is Africans are a part of the world. And the fundamental contradiction we've been having up to now is that white power has assumed that it is the only force in the world. And it has had the power to define the world based on its aspirations, its interests, and what have you. And that's influenced theory, philosophy for the longest period of time. And whites have been the subjects of history, and we've all been objects of history. We have no interests of our own, except for that's defined by us. So what African internationalism does, it gives us the ability to see a whole world, and not just the white world, or the world as defined by white people. It gives us the ability to become subjects of history. And in so doing, we believe that we open the doors for all of the oppressed peoples around, and all the people in the world to see the world correctly. And so that's what I wanted to say. Now, this study that we're dealing with, you know, we're going to be using terms of physics and chemistry, and we're not trying to create physicists or chemists or anything like that. We want to build revolutionary consciousness. And I don't like the examples in many instances that Cornforth offers us in this text that he is providing, but he's writing a text for intellectuals and for sectors of the petty bourgeoisie that he assumes is going to lead this movement. We have to be able to communicate to the working class, to the African working class, and to the peoples of the world. So given my druthers, we wouldn't have been using these examples of chemistry and of physics and biology, et cetera, because there's a world out here that we can understand. But we'll work with this to some extent. And I don't think all of them are good examples that we'll read from Cornforth. I want to, first of all, remind us why we will be engaged in a discussion. It's a discussion of philosophy. Because most of us understand philosophy as being something that's created in these rarefied environments, you know, these ivory towers where people have these, you know, obscure discussion and they're the only ones who know what the hell they're talking about. And I'm not quite sure they know what they're talking about, but they say these things, and the more confusing they are, their explanations of the world, then the deeper they are. You know, you don't understand. This must be pretty profound, because I didn't understand a damn thing that he just said, right? And so we're saying that, and people have been intimidated by this thing of philosophy, you know, and but it's critical because to talk about philosophy is simply to talk about our understanding of our place and destiny in history, in society. That's what philosophy is all about. And there are different ways that people understand this, different approaches that people take. And some of these are good approaches in the sense that they are scientific and they're grounded in actual conditions of the world. They have the ability to not only see where you are now, but how the hell you got here. Because you really don't know where you are if you don't know how you got here. You really don't. You really have no idea where the hell you are if you don't know where you came from, right? Because it's more than just a particular location. It's a location in relationship to the past and the future. Wherever you are today is more than just a spot here. It is a spot in relationship to the past and future, and in relationship to all the other things around you. You cannot understand where you are without, not adequately, without some understanding of what's around you, where you came from, and where it is you're trying to go. It doesn't make any sense. There's no such concept that can make any sense about where you are that doesn't consider where you're trying to go, where you're coming from, and all the things that are around you. Conceptually, it's impossible. If you try to think about that, conceptually, it's impossible to know anything about where you are, right? So we say that you have to have an understanding of where you came from. You have to understand the history of a process to be able to understand anything about the process. It's like going into a movie in the middle of the movie, and you can see all kinds of dramatic things happening in that movie, but you really don't know anything except what's exciting at that moment. Right? You can take a snapshot. It doesn't tell you anything about what's happening at that moment. How the hell did you get here? You know, why is that guy strangling this guy in the movie, right? I mean, it's horrible. Somebody's strangling somebody, and if you don't know what led to that, right? So anyway, philosophy, we think, is really important. And it informs every assumption that we have about the world, about ourselves. And usually, and all the time in any society, it's the dominant social forces that actually create and define philosophy, the worldview. It informs how all of us see the world. When we talk about philosophy, when we talk about how we see the world, everybody says, well, I know what I think, and yeah, you know what you think. And that should be enough. I know what I think. But most of us don't know that even thinking, how you come to certain kinds of conclusions, many instances, and most of them has been preordained. What is normal right now is abnormal in some other times. People talk about human nature. Human nature means something different today than it meant when you threw rocks at somebody and stoned them to death because you thought they created some kind of offense. And even the offenses that people commit in society is based on the interest and worldview of whoever leads that society, right? Somebody who's trying to escape from slavery, kill a slave master. You just broke the law, right? According to that society. Any society where slavery exists, killing the slave master is against the law. It is inhumane. It is immoral. It is a horrible thing if you live in a society based on slavery. If you live in a society based on colonial domination, where a society, a sector of a population has stripped another sector of everything that it has, every hope, every dream, every aspiration that it could possibly have on the one hand, and on the other hand, its hopes, its dreams, its aspirations rely on keeping that other group down like that. That's a social order that you have. This is what we talk about when we talk about dialectics. You've got to recognize that there is no such thing as an oppressed people unless there's an oppressor. You can't have, just oppressed people. You don't walk around oppressing yourself, right? There is an oppressor. At the moment you admit that people are oppressed, then you have to say there's an oppressor, which is one of the reasons the system doesn't want to recognize African people as being oppressed, which is why the system would say, well, you do it to yourself. They create certain IQ tests and all this other kind of stuff to convince the world, convince itself, first of all, and to convince us that there's something wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with the system itself. The system cannot make a self-criticism. The system cannot teach a history to say, we've got everything we've got because we killed all the indigenous people, stole their land, raped their children and their people, and brought Africans to this place and ripped them off for everything they've got, and the conditions they experience today is a consequence of that. It can't say that. It can't make that kind of self-criticism. That's why it is the subject and we're the objects of history. That's why we have to tell our own story, our own history as people who have been victimized by the system. We have a completely different worldview than the oppressor. We have different aspirations than the oppressors. And yes, we wish death to the oppressor. And you can't understand that. Why in the hell is that? This must be some vicious criminal, some vicious animal that wants the oppressed dead. I don't see myself as oppressor, because a system and the rulers of any society have to see their rule as being just and permanent. The system will not work. At the moment you see the system being able to reflect on its rule as unjust and not permanent, that's a shaky foundation for that system to be in. It has to believe that its rule is just and that it is permanent, and it has to convince us that its rule is just and permanent. They be suffering heart attacks and ulcers, and you'd have spikes in the death rates of white people who can't understand what the hell is going on today. And this is what you see now for the first time in so long, this spike in the death rate, white people committing suicide. White people, we used to call it junkies being junkies, now they call it opioid dependent or something to that effect, right? Because there is the system has to believe that it's a system that is just and it's permanent. It has to believe it's permanent. And if it doesn't believe it's permanent, and that's one of the fears that the people we are talking about who are afraid of freeing all the black people from prison, because there's an assumption this thing might not be permanent. If all these people get out of prison, what's going to happen to me and mine? What's going to happen to us? There's an assumption, though there's no evidence in history that African people are going to rob and kill all the white people. There's no evidence in history for that. But there's just some assumption that if black people have all their freedom, then what the hell is going to happen to us? And what's going to happen, you're just going to have to get a job like everybody else. You have to pee in the bottle like everybody else and get a job. So anyway, I just want to share this briefly. I've got so many sections of things This is really important, I believe. And it does take us to this discussion of dialectics and dialectical materialism. So we say that, oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at, okay, I'm looking at Vanguard. I'm on page 286, and I want to go, and let's go to 285, and that's on the first full paragraph. It explains a little bit of why we're having this discussion. It said the African People's Socialist Party sprang from the very bowels of the remorseless reality and struggles of our people. As we developed, we were increasingly forced to shed all reliance on religion, other forms of superstition, and the goodwill or moral epiphany of our oppressors. And that's what too often is required of us. There has to be some moral epiphany of the ones who oppress us. That's what we're taught all the time. In many ways, that's what the fight against racism is. Get white people to understand and to come to some moral epiphany, right? Our struggles to understand our reality, while occasionally encumbered and influenced by the worldview of the educated and upper classes, were rooted in attempts to solve the real problems of the concrete contradictions in which our people are embroiled. We were forced to learn that our preconceived notions, gleaned through colonial civics books, preachers, and liberal white friends, only help to obscure the real contradictions with which our people are confronted. We came to recognize that we must understand the world just as it is, not as we would wish it to be. We were forced to become philosophical materialists. Materialism teaches us that the world is tangible, knowable, and can be experienced through the senses. And this is important, to be able to trust your senses, right? It teaches us that all existing phenomena result from material causes that come into being, develop, and pass away according to the laws of the motion of matter, which is physics, by the way. Materialism informs us that the material world is primary. This world we live in is primary. It is objective reality that exists independently of the mind and will of individuals. It does not require permission of gods or important persons for its existence. The development of the African People's Socialist Party during our historical, at this time, 41-year trajectory in the midst of intense struggle compelled us to understand that the savage and genocidal brutality inflicted upon our people and the world by Europeans or whites has a material basis. And, you know, that's really critical in terms of understanding, because white people are mysterious to so many people around the world. It's a mystery. I mean, the kinds of stuff that's been done to the world. And so we have to come up with some explanation of why. How can somebody do these things? How can they, you know, kill women and take pregnant women and cut their stomachs open and, you know, bayonet the babies and play volleyball with them? And how can people do this kind of stuff? It's been a mystery, right? And so we're saying, and so people have come up with conclusions that white people, you know, are not humans. They are the devil. They are the devil, and even Khomeini, who was the first leader of the Iranian revolution that overthrew the Shah, came up that America was the what? Great Satan, was the Satan. How do we understand this thing that's happening to us? And so we say that, so there is a material basis for it. It's not that. It's not that some genetic thing, you know, because there's a political, there's a politic, a philosophy in the African community that's by a very learned educator that puts forth the notion that white people are genetic mutants. That's why they do this stuff. We're saying there's a material basis for it, though, and that we need to understand. Of course, to say that they're mutants is also to say that there's a material basis, as opposed to there being the devil, that there's a material basis. And it's not due to the will of the gods or simply some moral deficiency on the part of whites. And then we say that while the humanity of Europeans was clearly open to suspicion, the original nation of Islam, for example, declared the white man to be the devil. The answer to the avaricious motivation of white people is not to be found in an examination of morality, religion, or genetics. Our party and movement were forced to conclude that all humans, including Europeans, are trapped by an absolute necessity to secure and develop the means of subsistence. In other words, the primary motivating factor in human society is the production and reproduction of life. Without life, all other questions, religion, culture, genetics, etc., are moot, meaningless. Indeed, culture is a byproduct of the process of producing and reproducing life. However, the process of Africans producing and reproducing life was drastically disrupted and altered by the European attack that resulted in the capture and colonial enslavement of Africa and Africans. This attack by Europeans on Africa also resulted in the imposition of artificial borders that separate the dispersed African nation from our human and material resources and from a meaningful relationship among ourselves and with the peoples of the world. We don't have our own relationship with each other or with the peoples of the world. We don't have our own relationship. That's been altered, affected by somebody else capturing control of our entire life process, the ability to produce and reproduce life, to be able to control the capacity to feed, clothe, and house ourselves, to use our own resources for our own benefit freely. We don't have that ability. That's affected our relationship with each other. That's affected our relationship with the whole world. That's affected our view of ourselves, especially since how we understand much of the world comes from how the system teaches us. You know, I mean, we live in a situation where African people get taught every day that a man's supposed to be able to take care of his wife. If you don't take care of your wife, etc., you're not a man. You're less than a man, on the one hand. On the other hand, the system does everything to make sure that African men are killed, imprisoned, can't do anything. If you look like you're going to do what a white man is expected to do to take care of his wife and family, you die, or something worse happens to you. This is the kind of thing that we grew up in, and therefore that affects even our relationship with each other. It affects what I think of myself. If every decision that I make for my wife, my family, my children is a life-threatening decision, it's something that can kill me. I can't even have an argument with a 19-year-old clerk in a department store without security being called and the risk of going to jail on every occasion. That's the life. That affects our relationship with each other. My wife doesn't appreciate me because she knows she shouldn't be in this situation according to how it's defined to us by white power itself, because a man takes care of his wife and children and you don't do that. And so she can't have a good relationship with me. She can't respect me because we have these assumptions that about white power affects how we understand everything as well. And because now we've been pushed out of history, we don't make our own history, we make white people's history. This is the reality that we're confronted with, you see. So we say that this attack by Europeans on Africa has resulted in the imposition of artificial borders that separate the dispersed African nation from our human and material resources and from a meaningful relationship among ourselves and with the peoples of the world. The material and human resources of Africa have gone to satisfy the requirements of life for Europeans at the expense of Africa and Africans. The process of Africans producing and reproducing life has not been primarily for Africa and Africans, it has been primarily for Europe and the white world at our expense. That's a frightening thing. The sexual relationship of African men and women. For example, in Sierra Leone, 1 out of every 8 African women will die in childbirth. So what should be a happy experience? A pregnancy is dreaded because of the great likelihood this woman is going to die. And that affects our sexual relationships, you know, what we are willing to do, etc. That's an imposition that is deep and profound and much deeper and more profound than people normally would even give a thought to. But that's our reality, you know. This progenitor of world capitalism, the attack on Africa and Africans, along with the European assault on Asia and the Americas, rescued Europe and Europeans from an oppressive, 1,000-year-long, disease-ridden, impoverished existence known as feudalism. Feudalism did exist. I did not make it up. I did not make it up. Feudalism exists, and Europe lived under this horrible conditions known as feudalism. And that's when we met Europeans, they were living under feudal domination. When the indigenous people met them here, they were living under feudalism. And it's this relationship that they established with us through violence and force that rescued Europe from feudalism, that created the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist system itself, the ruling class of that capitalist system, and the working class. All of them owe their existence to this attack on the world, this attack on the so-called, on the Americas, as we now know them, the attack on Africa. And this also is what created the identity, the single identity of this creature that we came to know as European, and this place that we came to know as Europe. Before then, we had a situation of just warring tribes of people in this territory that we now know as Europe, who defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other. That's Celts and Normans and Saxons and you know, you name it. But it was only through slavery in the first place, through the attack on Africa and the wealth and resources brought to what was known as Europe, through the attack on what we now know as the Americas. Tremendous amount of wealth came to Europe as a consequence of that. This came to this place. And this common effort, it became a common effort to extract wealth, resources, to loot Africa and the other peoples around the world that gave them a common identity, so that now they identify themselves not primarily in relationship to each other, but primarily in relationship to us. Here is where we have the birth of the European. Here's where we have the birth of the black man, the birth of the white man, coming from this entire experience now. So now, the Saxons are no longer Saxons, and Normans are no longer that, and Celts are no longer that. They're white. They're Europeans. And the rest of us are something else. And this is the process of creating wealth and well-being for what we now know as Europe, and hell for the rest of us. I mean, we are on a land now that white people are not indigenous to this land, nor are we. And I know, brothers and sisters, I know the line that African people were here a long time ago before slavery. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, you can find evidence of the presence of African people a long time ago, but It was not the attack on this land that put Africans into slavery, that robbed us of any potential for a future. It wasn't that. It was the attack on the indigenous people on this land that put them in the situation they're in, and the attack on Africa more recently that put us in this situation. So I'm not arguing who was here first or something like that. I'm talking about social systems rising from this conflict that we had. And so I get messages. I've been here too long in this so-called introduction, but I want to just say a little more. So this progenitor of world capitalism, the attack on Africa and Africans, along with the European assault on Asia and the Americas, rescued Europe and Europeans from an oppressive 1,000-year-long, disease-ridden, impoverished existence known as feudalism. This was the genesis of the capitalist system as a world economy created on the base of the enslavement of Africans and others. A scientific analysis of human society requires that we take a dialectical approach. We cannot see the world as static and ready-made. Society has to be analyzed as a process process that is in a constant state of motion, change, and development. There's always something new arising to replace the old, and all social motion occurs in relationship to this process of coming into existence and dying away. Europe's attack on Africa was effectively an assault on Africa's ability to produce life for itself. This assault has had the effect of pushing Africa and Africans out of history, history being the summation of the ongoing struggle to produce and reproduce life. Slavery, genocide, and colonialism are the stuff of which capitalism was born. African enslavement was first capital in the development of capitalism. The prevailing legal system, culture, religion, and general philosophical outlook of or worldview constitute the superstructure of capitalism thus conceived. Let me say that again. African enslavement was the first capital in the development of capitalism. The prevailing legal system, culture, religion, and general philosophical outlook or worldview constitute the superstructure of capitalism thus conceived. This superstructure is a natural product and reflection of this economic base of colonial slavery. Slavery and colonialism gave rise not only to capitalism, but also to the capitalist and working classes alike of Europe and North America. The workers and the bourgeoisie, the two primary capitalist defining classes, have occasionally fought great battles with each other since their inception as contending social forces. Nevertheless, both were born and developed on a platform of slavery and colonialism. Consequently, what is often called class struggle inside the U.S. and Europe is actually contention among the workers and the ruling class for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its stolen resources. This stuff that we call class struggle in Europe. It's been a fight between what has been defined as the workers and the bourgeoisie for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its stolen resources. The parasitic foundation of world capitalism continues to exist up to now as the true economic base upon which the entire superstructure of the capitalist-defined, capitalist-dominated world rests. The total existence of so-called white people and their ability to produce and reproduce life is dependent on this parasitic relationship that came into existence and came into being with the attack by feudal Europe on Africa and the world. Instead of more or less self-contained worlds existing in casual relationship to each other, there is one capitalist world system united by a parasitic economic relationship imposed by Europe and the rest of us. Instead of separate, more or less self-contained worlds existing in casual relationship to each other, there is one capitalist world system united by a parasitic economic relationship imposed by Europe upon the rest of us. There is therefore no European reality separate from that of Africa and the rest of the world. The entire world is now locked into a single dialectical process, a unity of opposites, whereupon the gruesome extraction of life and resources from Africa and the rest of the world is a condition for the life and development of what we now know as Europe, white people, and the capitalist system to which we have been forcibly affixed. The legal system, culture, white sense of sameness, and political institutions are reflections of this parasitic economic base. Every white aspiration and dream, every expectation for happiness and a good life, from a successful marriage to a secure future for their children, requires drone strikes in Pakistan, police murders and mass imprisonment in the African colonies and barrios in the U.S., and starvation and forced displacement of the oppressed throughout the world. This is it. This is it. This is what we're talking about. That's when we're talking about dialectics. It's not just some empty discussion. We're trying to explain the world because we want to fix it. We want to fix the conditions that we are confronted with, and we're saying that it wasn't some mysterious alien force, not some religion, not because your horoscope didn't read right or something to that effect, or you got some bad ganja that, explains the world. That there's a materialist approach to understanding this, and then there's dialectics, in which when we talk about examining human society itself, or society is redundant to say human society, but society itself, then we're talking about what is referred to as historical materialism. So I've spent a long time here, and I'm going to read quickly here. I've said so much because I think that it will help us to understand better this that I'm going to read from Cornforth, because we've got issues with some things by Cornforth, and I think that reading Cornforth will help us to understand a bit better what we just explained in Vanguard. So, laws of development. We're talking about laws of development. To understand development, we must understand the distinction between quantitative change, increase and decrease, and qualitative change, the passing into a new state, the emergence of something new. So there's a difference in quantitative change and qualitative change. Quantitative change, increase, decrease, faster, slower, hotter, colder, bigger, smaller. Qualitative change is a creation of an entirely different state. Quantitative change always leads at a certain critical point to qualitative change. And similarly, qualitative differences and quantitative changes always rest on quantitative differences and quantitative changes. Development must be understood, therefore, not as a simple process of growth, but as a process which passes from quantitative changes to open, fundamental qualitative change. Let's say more about this. Further, this transformation of quantitative into qualitative change takes place as a result of the conflict or struggle of opposite tendencies. I'm in Cornforth's piece now. I'm reading from Cornforth now on chapter 8, and what we have on page 77. Further, this transformation of quantitative into qualitative changes takes place as a result of the conflict or struggle of opposite tendencies which operate on the basis of the contradiction inherent in all things and processes. Contradictions inherent in all things and processes. And the Marxist dialectical method, therefore, teaches us to understand processes of development in terms of the transformation of quantitative into qualitative changes, and to seek the grounds and the explanation of such development in the unity and struggle of opposites. That's obscure, and don't worry about it. So what do we mean by development? In stressing the need to study real processes in their movement and in all their interconnections, Stalin pointed out that in the processes of nature and history, there's always renewal and development. For something is always arising and developing, and something always disintegrating and dying away. When that which is arising and development comes to fruition, and which is disintegrating and dying away finally disappears, there emerges something new. For as we saw in criticizing mechanistic materialism, processes do not always keep repeating the same cycle of changes, but advance from stage to stage as something new continually emerges. This is the real meaning of the word development. We speak of development where stage by stage something new keeps emerging. Thus there is a difference between mere change and development. There's a difference between mere change and development. Development is change proceeding according to its own internal laws from stage to stage. And there's equally a difference between growth and development. This difference is familiar to biologists, for example. Thus, growth means getting bigger, merely quantitative change. Growth means getting bigger, merely quantitative change. But development means not getting bigger, but passing into a qualitatively new stage, becoming qualitatively different. For example, a caterpillar grows longer and fatter, then it spins into a cocoon and finally emerges as a butterfly. This is development. A caterpillar grows into a bigger caterpillar, it develops into a butterfly. Okay? Processes of nature and history exemplify not merely change, not merely growth, but development. Can we then reach any conclusions about the general laws of development? This is the further task of materialist dialectics, to find what general laws are manifested in all development and to give us, therefore, the method of approach for understanding, explaining, and controlling development. So we say quantity and quality, the laws of the transformation of quantitative into qualitative change. This brings us to the two latter features of Marx's dialectical method as explained by Stalin. The first of these may be called the law of the transformation of quantitative into qualitative change. What does this mean? All change has a quantitative aspect, that is, an aspect of mere increase or decrease, which does not alter the nature of that which changes. But quantitative change, increase or decrease, cannot go on indefinitely. At a certain point, it always leads to a qualitative change. And at that critical point, or nodal point, as Hegel called it, the qualitative change takes place relatively sudden, by a leap, as it were. For example, if water is being heated, it does not go on getting hotter and hotter indefinitely. At a certain critical temperature, it begins to turn into steam, undergoing a qualitative change from liquid to gas. You see, a cord used to lift a weight may have a greater and greater load attached to it, but no cord can lift a load indefinitely great. At a certain point, the cord is bound to break. A boiler may withstand a greater and greater pressure of steam up to the point where it bursts. A variety of plant may be subjected to a series of changes in its conditions of growth for a number of generations. For instance, to colder temperatures, the variety continues unchanged until a point is reached when suddenly a qualitative change is induced, a change in the heredity of the plant. In this way, spring wheats have been transformed into winter wheats and vice versa as a result of the accumulation of a series of quantitative changes. So we're seeing that the difference in quantitative change and qualitative change, that's the difference in growth and development. And so people, and especially liberals, they can really appreciate growth, but it's development, that takes this big leap forward that people often refer to as revolution, that frightens liberals. This change of the transformation of quantitative into qualitative change is also met with in society. Thus, before the system of industrial capitalism comes into being, there takes place a process of the accumulation of wealth in money form in a few private hands, largely by colonial plunder, this is in parentheses, and of the formation of a propertyless proletariat by enclosures and the driving of peasants off the land. This is a typical Marxist explanation of the emergence of capitalism. But I want to say something else has happened, and we mentioned it in passing just a few minutes ago, because something else happened that was necessary for the rise of capitalism, and it changed the world. And we found that on page 288. We talked about how Europe went out into the world. They were living under feudal domination and then engaged in the whole slave trade, the attack on Africa, and what we now call the Americas and much of the other world. And then we said what happens now is a whole change that's not recognized most by European Marxists or otherwise. What they see with Europe being now the subject of history, the subject of everything, they see what is happening to Africa, to Asia, to what we now call the Americas, only as it relates to the development of Europe. Do you understand? This is the only thing they can see. But something else has happened. A whole new world has been created now. And this is how Europe rescues itself from feudalism and the rest, and the conditions in Europe is through this connection. And then we say here that the total existence of white people and their ability to produce and reproduce life is dependent on this parasitic relationship that came into being with the attack by feudal Europe on Africa and the world. Further, instead of separate, more or less self-contained worlds existing in casual relationship to each other, there is one capitalist world system united by a parasitic economic relationship imposed by Europe upon the rest of us. You see that? So we have this leap, but this is not the leap that the Marxists understand and see. Do you understand what I'm saying? You've got a whole new process that comes into a being. You don't just have Europe over here anymore, and Africa over here, and Asia over here, and the Americas over here. You got a single system. And you have to look for the fundamental contradiction, looking at the whole system and not just what's happening with white people in Europe, in the so-called contest between the white working class and the white ruling class. You're with me on that. African internationalism took us there, taught us there. This understanding, this is profound. This is why when I'm in New York at the so-called peace thing, and where they're talking about fighting against the wars, etc., for them, the wars is only something that affects Europe and European people. They can talk about Jewish Assange, they can talk about Chelsea or Manning and what have you, but we've been engaged in this war now for 400 years or more, right here in this country. And this war is not recognized because this war is the thing that took us into warfare, is the thing that gave birth to America and to Europeans and white people. Do you see? And so for them, they can talk about Jewish Assange, they can talk about Chelsea or Manning and these heroic figures, but Sundiata is going to die in prison unless something happens in the next few months. And, we've got all these Africans, we got the Mexicans, land stolen from them, dying trying to cross the desert, coming from one stolen part of Mexico, coming from one stolen part of Mexico into another stolen part of Mexico as illegals and whatever, dying because this system, this new thing came into existence. And the fact is that the subjects, the writers of this history, the ones who articulate the reality are the ones who are benefiting from this relationship. So some people are opposed to Trump building a wall. Don't build a wall on the one hand. But on the other hand, they are not opposed to Mexican land, territory, future, and everything being stolen from them. So you got the same liberals who can condemn Trump for talking about a wall, but they can't say give up California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, all those other things that's turned these people into aliens on their own land, right? And have robbed them and their children of a future indefinitely unless something happens. This is the world that we have now, not just a world, like where white people, the central, that's defined particularly solely as it relates to the significant white people. And Marxists, leftists have done the same thing. They define this whole struggle to make communist revolution, etc., and they define the white working class, the industrial working class. They don't often say white, they say the industrial working class, which is white, as the critical force to make this happen, and the rest of us are auxiliaries to this process. So the African struggle, the Mexican struggle, all of this, we are auxiliaries, and when we fight to liberate Africa, liberate the Mexican people, then we are what they would characterize as destroying the unity of the working class, of this, what do they call it, the international, multinational working class. This is how they would characterize this. And so it's just another way of protecting the same social system that requires for its existence the ongoing strangulation of the future and resources, human and material resources, of Africans, so-called Mexicans, and other peoples around the world. This discussion of dialectics is a really important discussion. And I say dialectics as opposed to Marxism. because Marx used this method of investigation and helped to develop this method of investigation and analysis, and so do I. But I've come to different conclusions about reality than Marx did. I'm not a Marxist. I am an African internationalist because I had to start off from a place that Marx never could have perceived. Marx was a very bright man. He was an extraordinarily brilliant man, and what have you. But you can get a brilliant person, the smartest person in the world, and then ask them to solve the wrong problem, and they'll just come up with brilliantly wrong answers, smart, wrong answers. And that's why you can take the method. I remember being so disgusted when I was a young person and in school. And the math teachers will always say that I don't want to know just the answers. I want to know how you got it, how you got the answer, right? And because you can come up with some answers and whatever, but if you can't track that process of how the hell you got there, then you're no smarter than we were when you started off. You know what I'm saying? So we need to know how this thing started, how we got to where we are. So we say that, and this thing that he talks about here, this is interesting, because you would hear sometimes Marxists and other really smart intellectuals who would tell us that capitalism developed primarily because of this trade. That trade, abundance in trade, escalation in trade, and this kind of stuff resulted in the emergence of capitalism. But they don't say trade in what? They don't say, that the so-called the slave trade. They don't say that. This is where it came from. They don't say, and this is what Cornforth writes. Thus before the system of industrial capitalism comes into being, there takes place a process of the accumulation of wealth and money formed in a few private hands, and then in parentheses, largely by colonial plunder. In parentheses, largely by colonial plunder. And even that doesn't, tell the full story, because when he's writing colonial plunder now, and the formation of a propertyless proletariat by enclosures and driving of peasants off the land. These are the peasants who were driven off the land in Europe. And many people will say that this is primitive accumulation. Even Marx confused this question. But the peasants were driven off the land for what? Why were they driven off the land? To escalate the whole process of production that came about as a consequence of slavery and colonialism. This is what gave rise to the emergence of capitalism. And I just think this is what we have come to understand. At a certain point in this process, when enough money is accumulated to provide capital for industrial undertakings, when enough people have been proletarianized to provide the labor required, the conditions have matured for the development of industrial capitalism. At this point, an accumulation of quantitative changes give rise to a new qualitative change in the development of society. We've identified the change, the development much earlier than where Cornforth has got to. This change happened immediately. The thing that dragged Europe out of feudalism was slavery and the colonialism. This is the fundamental change that took place, that gave rise to this new thing, that even the conditions for, as I said, chasing the peasants off the land, the so-called land enclosure acts. In general, qualitative changes happen with relative suddenness. By a leap, something new is suddenly born, though its potentiality was already contained in the gradual evolutionary process of continuous quantitative change that went before. But the thing that we know happened, this great leap, was slavery and colonialism. And a new thing came into existence. That's essentially what we are seeing. That's when it happened. That's the fundamental thing that changed the whole world into a single economy. In fact, Marx was close to it. He said that a precondition for capitalism was the trade in African people that led to a whole different world economy. Or he suggested that. Thus we find that continuous, gradual, quantitative change leads at a certain point to discontinuous, certain qualitative change. We have already remarked in an earlier chapter that most of those who have considered the laws of development in nature and society have conceived of this development only in its continuous aspect. So most people who have seen it can only see this continuous aspect. They can't see this certain leap, this change, this transformation, this move from simply quantitative change to qualitative change. And that's liberalism. The essence of liberals is that they love the quantitative change. Just keep getting hotter, just keep getting hotter. They want to keep getting hotter forever, but they don't want to ever see gas coming from it. They don't ever want to see the great leap that happens suddenly and abruptly. And that's what revolution is in the real world. And we say revolution, but it happens in other ways too, because quantitative change always leads to qualitative change. If we're out here every day selling the burning spear, organizing among the masses of people, you don't see the change right away. If you heat water, it doesn't, boom, all of a sudden happens like that when you put the kettle on. You don't even see the change for a while while the water is heating. It takes a while. But if you continue to heat the water, you know that after a while that water is going to turn to gas. It's going to, boom, happen, and it happens suddenly like that. If you didn't know that, you would have to watch every time you put some hot water on the kettle. You'd have to stand and watch to make sure it's going to boil. But you know it's going to boil. So you can go and iron, you can go and vacuum the floor while the water's boiling. And you can even put a kettle on that it'll signal you when the water's hot, because you know it's going to get hot. If you didn't know that, you'd be standing there forever. Okay, is it going to get hot this time, right? And if you know certain things about this as it relates to human society, if you know where the fissures are in human society, if you know what gave birth, what the origin of the system is, you know that the fault line is in the oppressed peoples of the world who came into this relationship with imperialism at gunpoint through violence, and that relationship is maintained in that way. And that's why there has to be violence all the time. That's why there has to be drones to maintain this relationship. If you know that it is extraction of value and wealth from the oppressed peoples of the world that keeps this thing afloat, you understand the crisis of imperialism today. You understand why they're in Afghanistan having to kill people to make sure that they can keep those resources, why they have to strangle Venezuela, why they have to attack Iran and all these other places, because this is the contradiction that this whole social system rests upon. You know why there's a cop in every African community. You know why there's an ongoing attack on black people in Africa and the rest of the world. This is what this system is constructed of. So if you're out there doing this work, and if you know that the people are the fundamental forces that would change the world, the people are the critical forces, the masses are the makers of history, and if you go out there every day, if you go into these communities and you're selling the spear, if you're soapboxing, if you're talking to people, if you're organizing people, you don't see the changes right away. What happens is the people, first of all, the people got to make sure that this is not a kettle with a hole in it, that the water will get hot, because they've been disappointed so many times by these kettles that people have put on the stove. So you are there often enough, because with human beings, of course, you have consciousness. And so you have to affect consciousness, but if you do the work regularly, if you organize the people, if you're intervening in all the social contradictions, sooner or later, the pot's going to boil. And that's what you have to understand. That's what African internationalism helps us to understand, that if you keep doing this work, the quantitative change will lead to qualitative change. And you will see that happen in the world. That's the thing that informs us. That's what keeps us out there being able to do it, because we have confidence in science. And that's what we're talking about now, science. Not whether Jesus is going to come back, not whether some mysterious thing. I mean, after 2,000 years, you think after a while you wouldn't, anyway. So, so this is what is crucial for us. This is why we're having this discussion now. So people who do this work can have confidence about victory, so that we can take this understanding to the masses of our people, so that people can be armed to the teeth ideologically, so that people can be liberated, their consciousness, their ability to see and analyze the world can be liberated, because the people are ingenious. That's where the genius is, and the people will be able to make this struggle, and especially if they're freed from the constraints or the restraints that's placed on their consciousness by the petty bourgeoisie or by imperialism itself. And the thing that's so beautiful about this is that most of the working class are not in the same trap with the understanding of the world that the African petty bourgeoisie is. They don't go to school that much, or if they're in school, they are traumatized and have all kinds of problems in the school. They're not like the petty bourgeoisie. In order for an African to stay in school through high school, it's a trauma. And to do that means most of the time you have to be beaten into submission. You have to become one of them, etc. And the ones who are always in trouble in school are the ones who struggle with everything that we've been taught in these institutions. And so we're not suckered into this situation. I'm going to give you one example and I'm going to quit. I remember just being in Oakland, California. In Oakland, California, they had this whole problem with some kind of fruit fly. I forgot what it was called, some kind of Mediterranean fruit fly. And that was really important because they had produced a lot of fruit in California, agriculture. And the fruit fly was creating real problem. I think it's the larva from the fruit fly that was left in the fruit that made the fruit unusable and therefore commercially problematic. And so the state of California was engaging in this whole thing about killing the fruit fly. And they were using airplanes coming over, spraying communities and stuff like that. And they gave the explanation of why they were doing it. And I was in a store one day, and the airplanes were spraying, and the Africans were talking about, hey, man, you know damn well this ain't got nothing to do with no fruit fly, right? They are spraying it because they're trying to do something to kill black people or something else. And I'm saying to myself, I'm got a little more education than that. I heard the explanation that the guys gave. The reason they're killing, they've got to kill the fruit fly, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then it dawned on me, that's because, see, I'm smart. See, I'm educated. I know better than this stuff, right? I've been trained. Africans say, they ain't never come on no damn airplane spraying something to do us no favor. If they spraying something out of those airplanes over this community to do something bad to us, history has taught them that. Experience has taught them that. And even if I'm right in this instance, I'm generally wrong about how I understand how they understand. You see what I mean? So the masses of the working class are not affected in the same way, not trapped by the same assumptions about this social system than many of the petty bourgeoisie. And that's why the masses are waiting for us to knock on the door, to initiate a program, to bring them into this process. And that's why what happened here last night was so significant. One of the things, when we had this amazing Mustafa Bantu, Musa Bantu, we had this cultural event here, the poet and Black Power kind of a cultural event here that brings people from the community, young people and other people from the community, because we're taking this science, we're using every medium that we can to take this science to the masses of our people. Uhuru. So I'm asking for people to go ahead and read this. We didn't get that far directly into this study, but now you can read the study, and I think that it'll be much easier to understand. And you should also read from Vanguard on the theory of African internationalism, because one of the things we say that there are contradictions inherent in all things and processes. And capitalism is riven with contradictions, and the fundamental contradiction that we're looking at is the contradiction between oppressed and oppressor nations. And it is this contradiction, this is the process through which that gives, makes it possible for the water to heat and to turn to gas. This contradiction, this struggle here, this unity of opposites. When we talk about unity of opposites, I think it's really important to understand what we mean. When we say contradiction, we're looking at contradiction, we're looking at this dialectic that teaches us about the contradiction of the unity of opposites. And what do we mean when we say unity of opposites? We mean that, I use the example, if there's an oppressed people, there must be an oppressor. That's a unity of opposite. One requires for the other, one requires for its existence, the existence of the other. You can't have oppressed without oppressor. And it's simple. You can't have up. You can't even explain up without down, in without out. There's a unity of opposites. They both rely, for the definition, each relies on the existence of the other. You see what I'm saying? And so this is part of how we understand what dialectics is all about. It's exploration of the contradiction that constitute this unity of opposites. And this is where this contradiction, the resolution of this contradiction gives birth to something new. it changes, it gives birth to something new, this contradiction between inherent in all processes and things. And in this instance, this process, this thing, is a contradiction between oppressor and oppressor nations, between the colonizer and the colonized. And the resolution of this gives birth to something new. And what is that something new? And that something new immediately, obviously, is a liberated Africa and African people. But we believe the core to the struggle of the peoples of the world is centered in Africa. And the reason we say this with confidence is because the African Revolution is something that's been transported all around the world. We're on almost every continent. Africa is so rich that every entity that's trying to either maintain its strength and viability in the world or wants to achieve strength and viability in the world, they're concentrated in Africa right now, as we have in this discussion. AFRICOM is there, Chinese are there, Indians are there, Turks are there, Canadians are there, Germans are there. Everybody who's looking for a future in the world to maintain their place in the world is in Africa. This is the critical contradiction. And African people in all these other places around the world, this is where capitalism is going to die and a new world can emerge that will liberate all of humanity. Uhuru. Yeah.
Let's salute our chairman, our leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, for that powerful study and that profound analysis of history and just telling us where our situation is, how we got in this condition, and is informed by African internationalism. So I know you have been truly enlightened. It is now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's tuning in via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate all of your engagement. Please continue to invite your friends and family to this study and share widely on all of your social media platforms. We have people watching from all over, Chairman. Oh, we have people in the Netherlands, Tucson, Arizona, Philadelphia, Portland, St. Louis, Miami, St. Petersburg, Chicago, Huntsville, Washington, D.C., Fort Myers, and people in different other countries. Rotterdam. Yeah, we always, this brother always comes in. And now I just got another thing. We have viewers in Clearwater, Florida, Tampa, Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, Miami, Gainesville, Florida, Boston, Massachusetts, Kuwait, Rotterdam, Netherlands, Tucson, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Germany, Huntsville, Alabama, Richmond, Virginia. So this theory of African internationalism is spreading abroad all over the country, Chairman Uhuru. So our first question we have here, or comment rather, Rhea. Okay, Rhea in St. Louis commented, watching from St. Louis, white reparations to African people are a revolutionary demand, not parasitic charity that keeps colonialism alive. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we talk about liberalism, and they love the idea of charity, right? They can give charity, they can keep the existing social system going on forever, and it benefits them, so they can show their own beneficence by giving charity and things like that. But it's the sudden change, it's the transformation, it's revolutionary thing that makes the difference. And so some people would rather give charity forever than to actually come into actual solidarity with the African Revolution. Thank you, Comrade Raya. Uhuru.
Mumuni Banda, Sina commented, watching live from Germany, revolution is the only answer for black people. We need to control our resources and the mindset of our people.
Uhuru.
We have Nasser and Kuwait asks, can the chairman elaborate on the difference between African internationalism and Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, Pan-Africanism, first of all, even Kwame Nkrumah, who was considered a Pan-Africanist by many, and who himself may have called himself a Pan-Africanist at one point, is simply an aspiration. The fact it's not a philosophy, and it is an aspiration of the petty bourgeoisie. It was born as a political movement. That's not to say that there was not a concept, a thing called Pan-Africanism before this, but as a political movement, it was born in 1919. And W.E.B. Du Bois, in this war that he was making with Marcus Garvey, who led an African working class anti-imperialist movement up to 11 million African people around the world that challenged imperialism. Du Bois created this Pan-Africanist movement to contend with and fight against the the Garvey movement, and it has resulted today in people creating this thing that's supposed to be Pan-Africanism that links Garvey and Du Bois, but they were different. And Du Bois said it, and so did Garvey said it, and they were not the same, and it was understood at that time. And now, because Pan-Africanists cannot claim any kind of successful movement, the Pan-Africanists would link themselves to Garvey. And they need Garvey because Du Bois made such an ongoing assault. And Du Bois bragged about the fact that he worked with the colonizer. So all the meetings we have, we're working with the colonizer, the colonial powers, and the rest of it. And there's history. Well, so we're different. And anybody who calls himself or herself a Pan-Africanist is a Pan-Africanist. An African internationalist is not anybody. An African internationalist is based on scientific a revolutionary theory that leads us to communism, the overthrow of capitalism itself, and Pan-Africanism does not require that. Uhuru.
Do we have any questions from the audience or comments at this time? Chairwoman Penny Hess.
Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru.
And this is Penny, African People's Solidarity Committee, and I just really want to express my profound unity with this study and with this whole series that's been going on now for I think a couple of months on this question of dialectical materialism as as one of the key foundations of African internationalism, and just bringing the science to it and the challenge for white people to embrace this science that we have to see, and this whole understanding that you have been putting out, that African people produce and reproduce life for white people and for others, and that, just for white people participating in the exploitation of African people by any means necessary, which is what we have done with the incredible violence and capitalism, disrepute, as you say, and how it has been that goes on today that enables, that still continues today, that this is what levels the playing field for white people. This is what makes white people able to have money, to have prosperity, to send the kids to college, and also being actively participating in the genocide against indigenous people and stealing this land. And I just all the ways that happens, and the question of reparations and the responsibility of white people to see what it means to be naming ourselves the subjects of history, and how what you're saying is that we have to understand our place in history and everything before and after, and it's incredibly a tenuous place as the subjects of history, because African people and oppressed and colonized peoples are struggling to overturn the system. And I just really unite with the science that you are bringing to this. As you're saying, it's not a moral epiphany.
Yeah.
It's understanding the science of what is the future and what is the present. And just wondered if you would comment on
Well,
that.
I just think that I've always, for a long time anyway, I haven't always done that. For a very long time, I've appreciated how the question of theory has really been underestimated, understated. There's what white people and white leftists and Marxists call theory is so paltry, poverty-stricken, and on the one hand, but the role of theory in the African Revolution, this has been problematic. This is a struggle we've been involved in a long time. We've engaged in struggles with various organizations and tendencies within our movement around this issue of theory and the science, of theory that rests on science. And dialectical and historical materialism gives us a basis in science to come into certain kinds of conclusions around theory. But the parasitism, as we understand, it permeates everything. It's not just, it affects everything. And even if you look at the relationship, like right now, we're talking about St. Louis, but we could be talking about St. Petersburg, Florida. We could be talking about anything that's happening in Detroit or other places. You have situations where ordinary white people, this is not the bourgeoisie, this is sometimes just upper working class, if you will, white people, who get their pickup trucks and clipboards and stuff and ride around the African community, and they go mining. Do you understand? They mine. They find this place, that place, that place that they can buy because the property in the African community is always cheaper than it is in the white community. They come and buy cheap. They go in and put some paint on it. They flip it, as they call it. And then what happens is this is just an ordinary white guy who benefits from this. Here you are talking about make the South Side black again. You're talking about end gentrification. This guy's eating and feeding off this. This guy, who is just a so-called working class white person, now finds himself in opposition. Him and his wife, who works, they come and both work on that house in your community to fix it up so that they can make a whole bunch of money, or some money, more than what you could possibly. They got assistance from the police department. They move into a community, into a neighborhood. And the first thing they do is, when they move into the neighborhood, they organize a neighborhood association. When they organize it's a neighborhood association of two white people who live in the same house. Then in St. Petersburg, Florida, they get assigned a police who works with the neighborhood association. They go around the neighborhood and they find all the issues having to do with fixing up places. What do you call that? When places don't, the code violations and all of this other kind of stuff. And then they get the city to come mess with you because of code violation. Of course, you, 76-year-old woman whose husband died 10 years ago, and you're trying to keep this place by yourself, and you can't fix those things. And what happens is that the city then puts a tax lien on your property. They end up taking your property. They do all kinds of things in St. Louis, just driving out the African community. This is the most insidious thing you can see, and white people will benefit. They have barn sales. In the city of St. Louis, for example, they have all of these abandoned houses. I forgot how many thousands that there are. They listed them. And then they create this so-called land, what's the LRAs? Some kind of bank where they put all the city gets these properties, put them in this bank. And then they are available. If you can pass these requirements, you can get the houses. And now they got a very clever council person in St. Louis who said that he's going to sell, everybody can get a house for $1. So Africans say, wow, we can get this house for $1. But they don't tell you that it's going to take $50,000 to fix the house up after you get it. Where are you going to get $50,000 from? And you have a certain time frame within which you have to do that. So it's all treachery. And then what happened is, when they say you can get a house for $1, who is he talking to? He's talking to all the so-called investors, all those white companies and individuals who got enough money to come and take your house, take your property, take your neighborhood, and then bring the police in and to reshape the entire thing. I'm just saying, Comrade Penny, that this whole issue of parasitism is insidious. It's your culture. It's you singing a song now. They slam you for even having this rhythm, this song, this, and now they become, after they slam them, push you out of it, they take that as well. Everything that we create is stolen from us, it's taken from us on a regular basis. That's the parasite. And it's in the consciousness of the people here. It's not even something that's abnormal. It is parasitism. Expresses itself in 1,000 different ways throughout the entire relationship that we have with imperialism. I don't know if I addressed that or not, Penny, but that's something that we really, truly need to understand. That it's not some conscious, necessarily even a conscious decision, let's go over and mess over the white people. In fact, white people will come to the conclusion, something wrong with you. Something wrong with you. All these abandoned houses and all this stuff, you don't take care of your children, you don't take care of your property, you don't do this and that, and that's why I got it. Not because I'm experiencing something as a colonizer, right, etc. So, yeah, Uhuru.
Chairman,
Yeah.
Uhuru, for that concrete explanation and clear. Process, someone named Process on YouTube is tuning in to the study from Boston and wants to know, how is dialectical materialism reflected in the actions of the Uhuru movement?
Well, how's it? Almost everything that we do. I mean, the fundamental question is, first of all, to define what the critical contradictions are. I mean, we are helped by that. We don't see just the world that you get born into and just things just keep, growing a certain way. That there's a contradiction, a profound contradiction in human society, and in society at this moment in history. And the thing that we're looking at is this primary contradiction between the colonizer and the colonized, between oppressor and oppressed nations. And everything that we do, it revolves around ending the colonial exploitation and oppression of African people. And it's about, as some people would call it, even rescuing the productive forces, because that's what colonialism does. Colonialism takes away the ability of a people to feed, clothe, and house themselves. It takes your land, it takes your implements for production. It takes even your knowledge of production away from you. These constitute the forces of production. And what the party is involved in doing, and the Uhuru movement, is reversing that. And that's why what we do, we're not fighting against racism, which is idealism to the max. So you're fighting against the ideas in somebody's head. We're fighting concretely to take power. We're preparing to govern. And in every institution, we've got more than 50 institutions around self-determination that exist throughout the United States itself. And also what dialectical and historical materialism helps us to understand, that Africans are one people. And so we're fighting on different fronts throughout the world. We have the party in Africa, we have the party in Europe, we have the party here in this country, and we have the party in the Caribbean. So it's one whole organization dealing with this fundamental contradiction that has been posed on us by the rise of capitalism, because capitalism was born as a world system. It wasn't born as a Massachusetts system. It wasn't born as a system in England. It was born as a world system. It is capitalism that gave rise to white power in the whole world. And we are disintegrating it, disassembling it with everything that we do, every project that we have, every movement that's associated with it. And then, of course, we recognize that central to this development is the leadership of the African working class in its own revolutionary party, because the working class has to ascend to become the new ruling class. It has to push the African petty bourgeoisie out of the way, because the petty bourgeoisie is a social force that was given birth by the intervention of capitalism into our communities and societies that gave them a stake in the continuing existence of the social system as it is now. The working class has nothing to lose at all, to coin a phrase, except its change. And that's where this, our movement is centered, in the working class itself. And that's why we are right now speaking to you from 4101 West Florissant in St. Louis, an oppressed African working class community. Uhuru.
Uhuru, one more question. Okay, we want to make Uhuru, we made an error. There was a question from Nasir in Kuwait. His question was, why is it important to focus on imperialism rather than racism?
Mm-hmm.
The previous question was from a different viewer, other than Nasir from Kuwait. So Nasir's question is, why is it important to focus on imperialism rather than racism?
Yeah, it's really important, because the whole racism question in general is something that's imposed on African people. That somehow, and that's the reason for that, is because we are the foundation of the whole capitalist system. What has happened to African people doesn't mean that it didn't happen, or horrible things didn't happen to other people. We can give the data that shows how people in the Middle East, how people in South America, Caribbean, and all these other places are catching hell, and also fundamental to the rise of capitalism itself. But the thing is that this whole concept of racism, it really is something that will have you fighting to to actually perfect the system of oppression. It helps you perfect it. So what you're involved in is not against the system, but against how people act inside the system. It's this thing, the way you work to make white people like you, to change white people's attitudes about you. In some instances, become more like white people because it makes you more acceptable. That's what racism does. It's idealism. It makes the issue not the concrete material existence of our exploitation and oppression, but the ideological foundation. The racism is that philosophy, that ideology, that is the foundation of the capitalist system itself. As it was born out of the oppression and exploitation of African people, then the explanation that it gives for this is what we call racism. It's a form of white nationalism. The struggle against imperialism is to overthrow this relationship. If you overthrow the relationship itself, then the attitudes of white people and everybody in here would change. People, we change the material relationship that people have to reality. And that is what's going to make the difference. And that's the difference in fighting against racism and imperialism. And the thing is that In every instance, when people have fought against imperialism, at the end of the day, they were able to march into the Capitol, raise the flag of liberation, etc., and say, we are now free. Now, I don't know how the hell you raise the flag of anti-racism. I don't know how the hell you can declare victory when you won. I don't know how even somebody who's lost the struggle can surrender. How do you win that? It's not possible. So we change the conditions, we change the relations of power, and we'll change the attitudes of people. Uhuru.
Thank you, Chairman, for that profound analysis and for this study. We were truly enlightened. Because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. The study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideals. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today, and you want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuuhuru.org for your information regarding how you can apply. Get Burning Spear Media's new limited edition poster, a reproduction of the front page of the historic December 1982 edition of the Burning Spear newspaper, featuring coverage of the first international tribunal on reparations for black people. Get yours before they're gone at burningspearmarketplace.com. Pre-sales of the new limited edition of Omali Taught Me t-shirt end soon. Support the office of the chair and help us reach our fundraising goal to launch Uhuru Wabinki, an initiative to build an independent African economy. Click the link in the description box to pre-order your shirt today. Quantities are limited. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. Were you moved by Chairman's presentation this morning? You can bring this electrifying presentation to your school campus, bookstore, concert hall, and more. To book Chairman Omali Yeshitela for the Vanguard 2019 International Speaking Tour, contact Uhuru Tours at info@omaliyeshitela.org or call 727-914-3621. Sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise taking place December 14th through 19th. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is the annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overthrowing the conditions faced by African people worldwide. Our cruise destinations are Half Moon Bay, Bahamas, Nassau, Bahamas, and Freeport, Bahamas. You can enjoy political education on board with the chairman. On and off board excursions and more food than you can eat. To book, make your deposits, visit uhurulegacycruise.org or call the travel agent Linda Stern at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the African Socialist International and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. Thank you for all tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. And stay tuned after for promo on the Black is Back Coalition's annual Black People's March on White House. Uhuru, thank you.
Now is the time to throw off all hesitation. Open up new fronts of struggle and to launch every protest, demonstration, and anti-imperialist action.
The Black is Back Coalition recognizes that it's not enough to call for peace. We call for 2, 3, many Venezuelans.
From the ballot box to the barricades.
The boldest, newest vision, progressive platform that you will find out there in the world today.
As an act to deepen the crisis of imperialism.
This system is a foul social system born of slavery and genocide. It will never do anything for us.
Every protest against police and white civilian murder of our people.
Y'all think it's cool to kill black people and then get on paid leave? These police, man, these pigs, they are everywhere in our community, everywhere.
County police, state police, you name it, if there's a police organization, it is here.
Every mass mobilization to demand the end of the cruel, bloody economic war against Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Iran, Korea, and Russia.
The other wars, not just the one that might send some white kid to some place in the Middle East, but all these other wars.
The protesters continued to circle Times Square.
The attack that the U.S. is planning to launch against Syria represents an overall attempt on the part of U.S. imperialism to maintain its control over that region of the world.
We have to give them a problem that they can only solve to benefit us. Do you understand?
The U.S. and all imperialist powers, new and old, must be expelled from Africa, and the U.S. domestic colonial occupation forces known as police must be driven out of our colonized communities as part of the struggle against colonialism and imperialism.
I'm a revolutionary. Let me just tell you that right up front. I'm a revolutionary. I think that you have to overturn the whole damn system before we will ever be free. But I recognize that everybody in here ain't revolutionary. We need activity and action by masses of people who've never heard of revolution, never thought about revolution, but they believe in something called justice.
Join the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations for our annual march on the White House in Washington, D.C. on November 2nd and 3rd. For more information, go to www.blackisbackcoalition.org.
The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.